Hello again. Dan Alasso, Making History, and I am coming to you again today with another in this series that I'm developing on free thought history or secular humanism or the story of religion in American history. And some of the stuff that I'm reviewing as I go back through archival folders of my journal entries, my daily notes, my book reviews, is going to be very narrative, and it's going to tell stories of interesting people because I love interesting and unusual people in history, especially the folks who didn't get noticed in mainstream narratives or become part of textbooks. But I'm also finding a bunch of stuff that's a little bit more interpretive and theoretical that helped to form my understanding of the past and to support my conclusions, especially about the important role of free thought in American history. So I've decided that I'm going to include both types of information in this series on secular humanism and American politics. Maybe when it reaches some sort of critical mass, a book will emerge from all of this. That's the Substack dream, after all, right? So today's post is going to be a little bit on the interpretive and theoretical side, even maybe the historiographical side. I'm reviewing notes that I made about a 1998 book by Peter S. Field called The Crisis of the Standing Order that was published by the University of Massachusetts Press, and which I read in January of 2009 as I was just beginning my PhD program at UMass. Field's thesis, I thought, was that the standing order, which is a term used to describe the established Church of Massachusetts, Congregationalism, which had grown out of the Puritanism of Plymouth and Boston's founders. So his thesis was that the standing order sort of self-destructed in a war between wealthy proto-Unitarian Boston Brahmins and orthodox Congregationalist leaders. The Brahmins ministers represented the interests of their supporters, the Boston merchant elite, and developed a high literary culture and a sort of intellectualized liturgy to meet their needs. The Orthodox establishment, seeing their influence and their authority slipping, attacked the Brahmins in an attempt to retain their role as the spiritual rulers of Massachusetts. Field noted early on in the book that Puritan practice had always banned ministers from holding secular office. So their authority rested entirely on their leadership roles in the intellectual life of their communities. I think this statement is probably much more true of Boston, where he was focusing his study, than in rural towns like Ashfield, where although he might not hold office, the minister, along with the physician, if there was one, was typically the leading and often the only educated professional. Field said that the ministers of the standing order, in his words, gained cultural authority in direct proportion to society's uncoerced adoption of their ideas. It's ironic that the story of the Orthodox fight to retain control in Massachusetts is filled with their futile attempts to coerce. Not until they have completely hit bottom does Lyman Beecher convince them to try revivalist persuasion. But maybe they weren't interested in reaching the middle class until the Brahmin ministers had stolen the upper classes from them. Field cited an early 20th century article on the revolt against the standing order that I linked to in the text part of this post, and that I should probably go back and read again. I linked several passages from old books when I first wrote this, and they're still out there for me to circle back to, and for readers and viewers to check out if you're interested. And like Staloff in The Making of an American Thinking Class, Field built on a foundation of Weber, Economy and Society, which is also something I should probably get back to at some point. Field in this book proposes what he calls a social history of intellectuals, that would treat the idealism of intellectual historians with a big dose of skepticism, if not cynicism, while retaining a focus on intellectuals as not only important agents of social change, but as a class, which he observes is missing from Marxist analysis. In this role that he takes on as a new class theorist, Field argued with Weber that ownership of the means of production is not the sole measure of the social division of labor. He sought to undermine the belief that intellectuals are heroically engaged in the disinterested pursuit of truth. But it's unclear to me whether he proved his case. Reverend Jedediah Morse is a really nasty guy in Field's story, but I'm not completely convinced that he's insincere. What is clear to me is that the increasingly public disagreements between the Orthodox clergy and their urbane, polished, and increasingly rich adversaries presiding over pews filled with Brahmins made it clear to anyone paying attention in the early decades of the 19th century that the ministry was filled with partisans. This devolution of the hallowed, monolithic Puritan edifice into competing sects threatened to eliminate their claim to cultural dominance and divine inspiration. It's incredible to me that Jedediah Morse managed to survive the Illuminati hoax with any credibility at all. And that survival might be a topic for further study. The fight over the Hollis Professorship of Divinity, which was an endowed chair established in 1721 at the Harvard Divinity School. This fight in 1804 begins in a rare moment of physicality with the completion of the West Boston Bridge, November 23rd, 1793. This bridge, also called the Charles River Bridge, provided the first direct connection between Boston and Cambridge, which is where Harvard is located, and put the ferry monopoly that had been granted to Harvard at its inception out of business. Field suggested that in the administrative reshuffling that followed the financial change, the Orthodox leaders fought viciously but lost control of Harvard. The Charles River Bridge has its own very interesting story that I have talked about elsewhere. But my question in this context is, how solid had their grip on power been before? Had it been gradually eroding, perhaps, as the popularity of the Brahmin ministers grew? Field mentioned that Hollis professor David Tappan's pupils were among the brightest lights of the new Brahmin ministry. Was he arguing for an abrupt change where there was really a slow evolution? Similarly, Field said no reasonable Federalist believed Morse's Illuminati story. But the conspiracy theory did drive politics in the run-up to the election of 1800. So what was going on? Who were the Orthodox ministers talking to, besides themselves and the residents of smaller communities outside Boston? Were they effortlessly carrying public opinion in places like Ashfield? My research suggests not entirely. At what point did the Brahmin elitist ministry lose touch with regular people and allow a split to kind of solidify? Or was it ever in touch with them? Certainly not through institutions like the Athenaeum or the Anthology. That was a monthly literary magazine published by the Anthology Society, which had been established by Reverend William Emerson, the father of Ralph Waldo. And what about Western Massachusetts? Revivalism began there in the 1740s with Jonathan Edwards in Northampton, long before Beecher moved to Boston. Field passed rather quickly over the First Great Awakening, saying that it was a great threat to the standing order, but not really elaborating on how. And then, looking at the American Revolution, he placed the ministers firmly on the side of the revolutionists. And he says that until the committees of correspondence were formed, ministers had been nearly the only conduits of information, which again may illustrate his Boston-centric focus. Most of the Western Massachusetts ministers were Tories, supporters of England, until they had no choice, and some remained loyalists. Maybe highlighting Chauncey, Mayhew, and Thatcher gave Field an origin story of Orthodox ministers' views of their role in politics. But in the Puritan colony, this would have been taken for granted. Its survival after the Revolution is the issue. Field mentioned several items that don't fit really smoothly into his interpretation, like the fact that a prominent Westerner named Joseph Hawley brought a bill to the General Court in 1777 to disestablish the church. But, quote, he could not muster enough support even to bring it to the floor for a vote. And Field credited the clergy with defeating the 1778 Massachusetts Constitution without really providing much context. William Gordon, the chaplain of the General Court, got himself fired for criticizing the Constitution in the papers, and 13 ministers attended the Constitutional Convention as delegates of their hometowns. Where were these towns, and what was the agenda of the ministers? A lot of Western Massachusetts towns had instructed their representatives to block the Constitution if possible, but not over religion. So how did religious objections stack up to civil ones? Field didn't discuss this. According to Samuel Eliot Morison, there were at least 29 towns that distinctly stated their opposition to Article 3, establishing the church. Joseph Hawley said, I quote, "It is far from indisputable and positively denied by many, viz., that it is the duty of all men in society publicly and at stated seasons to worship, etc. It is inconsistent with the unalienable rights of conscience, which rights are certainly unalienable if mankind have, as the first article avers they have, any such rights." So this challenge to a legally established church in Massachusetts precedes the schism between the Orthodox and the Brahmin by decades. It was only after the infidel challenge had been defeated that the established church could return to its internal divisions. And I think this point is especially relevant for a free thought history of the period. Field didn't really deal with the gradual shift of attitudes that were observed by some at the time, and I have a link to some of those observations. And he credited the exigencies of the Revolution with imposing what he called a limited moratorium on theological controversy. He did outline the family ties between the proto-Unitarians and the merchant elite, and made a good case that theirs was as much a social as a religious enterprise. In fact, this mixing of the theological and mercantile elites seems to have been maybe the chief complaint of the Orthodox. John Thornton Kirkland married the daughter of George Cabot. William Ellery Channing married Ruth Gibbs. Harvard professors Andrews Norton and George Ticknor married the daughters of Samuel Eliot. And Edward Everett married the daughter of Peter Chardon Brooks, the first millionaire in Boston. Field went on to say that most wealthy Bostonians abandoned politics when the Federalists were defeated and set about establishing high culture. But his chronology wanders back and forth from the 1790s to 1808 and beyond. This vagueness seems to undermine his claim that these groups were acting as self-aware, unified classes when they battled over the Illuminati in 1798 or David Tappan's Hollis chair in 1803 to 1805. Field said, quote, "Almost to a man, Brahmin ministers had begun to eschew the kind of active participation in politics entailed in election day sermons and fast days. But was that chicken or egg? Their patrons, the Boston merchants, were disaffected with politics by 1800. They weren't necessarily looking for their ministers to rub their noses in their defeat, especially if it came along with fasting and listening to day-long sermons. The Brahmin ministers might have faced a different set of expectations if Jefferson had been defeated. Theology, said Joseph Stevens Buckminster, is the subject upon which much of our genius and learning has always been employed, and not seldom wasted." That's funny, in a sort of emperor's new clothes way. The merchants and their new ministers made a show of religion to please the society they lived in and to advance their own social standing. But that religion, they thought, ought to be intellectually stimulating and not too intrusive, not make too many demands on them. What a shock to the orthodox, who thought piety was something else entirely. Only 50 years had elapsed from the visible sainthood of the New Lights to the anthology's editorial policy of useful knowledge and harmless amusement, sound principles, good morals, and correct taste. It is a sound point, though, that Boston was different from the rest of the state because its churches were not, at this time, supported by taxes. They were all voluntary. This seems to have been a legacy of John Cotton. As a result, those who contributed more expected to be treated accordingly, even if they were no longer members on the basis of a conversion experience. But Field didn't really go into detail explaining how the halfway covenant had mitigated the requirements of membership or what effect that had had in the long run. And later in the book, Field admitted that John Adams had written to Jedediah Morse that the problems about which he was complaining were recent and Unitarian ideas had been around for 65 years. Field remarked that there were two distinct responses to the politics of the late 1790s among the Federalist ministers, and nearly all the ministers were Federalist. The Brahmin Federalists retreated from politics. The Orthodox Federalists went nuts. Of course, the Orthodox really couldn't retreat into moderation because the Brahmins had already claimed that hill. So who were their constituents? What was their market? It's unclear that they still had one, or had one for long. By 1820, even Morse's own parish, tired of what they called his engagements in and encouragement of controversies and indiscriminate distribution of contradictory pamphlets and tracts. They replaced him, and in response, he accused them of being obviously Unitarians. And that dislike of Unitarians was a sentiment he had developed over decades. In a letter to Oliver Wolcott Jr., dated July 13th, 1798, Morse had gone so far as to declare that it was, quote, necessary to exterminate dangerous enemies. The Boston clergy, who disagreed with him and refused to knuckle under to his own self-appointed authority. In his biography of Senator Harrison Gray Otis, Samuel Eliot Morrison said, neither Otis nor any other prominent Federalist subscribed to the theory, that is the Illuminati theory. While they had tried to support Morse's attacks on this imagined Republican plot to score political points, the Federalist papers, like the Columbian Sentinel and the Chronicle, had been nervous about their own credibility. Embarrassed by his recklessness, Field said, they shut Morse out. Maybe part of the problem ministers like Morse were having was they believed they were living in an earlier world where the clergy was not only the only source of information about the outside world for most people, but where the prestige of the clergy virtually guaranteed that whatever a pastor told his flock would be automatically and uncritically believed. Newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsheets of the Revolutionary era had definitely widened the average person's view of the world. But maybe the biggest damage was done by ministers like Morse, who showed themselves to be petty, partisan, and, worst of all, miserably wrong. And I think this change in access to information and this failure of the previous pundit class to notice it and adjust has obvious parallels for the present. Although the focus of Field's story is Harvard, the Yale connection to all of the Orthodox leaders is too good to pass by. Timothy Dwight demands a closer look. I need to get a book called Speaking Aristocracy to give myself at least one chance to see a positive portrayal of Yale and its presidents. In addition, the careers of the presidents of Amherst, Dartmouth, and Williams College, all of which were seminaries and defenders of orthodoxy, will probably also have some interesting surprises in them. Williams President Griffin, with whom Charles Knowlton talked a couple of times while he was living in Adams, seems to have been up to his elbows in controversy in the 1800s to the 1810s. Jedediah Morse's religious journal, The Panoplist, which he published from 1805 to 1810, claimed to be the antidote to the wickedness and infidelity spewed by the anthology. Morse wasted little time in calling for ministerial examinations to ensure creedal uniformity. Without rigid enforcement of correct doctrines, he said, quote, liberty, free inquiry, and private judgment were becoming instruments of infidelity and a fair mask under which apostasy from Christianity and hatred of all goodness have disguised themselves. I wonder about this type of language. To whom is he talking? Infidelity? Hatred of goodness? These people are other and still nominally congregational clergymen at this point that he's accusing and attacking, along with the people who fill their churches every Sunday. They're not some crowd of blood-drinking Satan worshippers, which did not exist, and they're not even a movement of actual freethinkers, who did exist. Field did not really explain who the intended audience for this type of rhetoric was, or how effective the rhetoric was. It certainly does seem to me that Morse was trying to equate these new apostates with infidels, which I guess is an indirect way of discovering the prevalence of free thought on the scene and the seriousness of the challenge that it too posed to orthodoxy. So another thing to pursue in a history of secular humanism in this era. The Congregationalist Andover Seminary was established in 1807 to answer this challenge. Its creed, which all faculty had to swear adherence to and renew their vows every 5 years, pledged, quote, unswerving opposition, not only to atheists and infidels, but to Jews, Baptists, Mohammedans, Arians, Pelagians, Antinomians, Arminians, Socinians, Sabellians, Unitarians, and Universalists. So, basically, they hated everybody. The Brahmins, to whom the Orthodox actually surrendered Harvard when they moved their operation to Andover, in Field's words, deemed the doctrinal hair-splitting of the Orthodox distasteful, uncharitable, and anachronistic. William Ellery Channing called the creed part of Andover's espionage of bigotry. Field pointed out that the growing class nature of Massachusetts society may not have been the efficient cause, but it was certainly a necessary cause of the crisis. He said the older and increasingly female communicants were less prosperous than their neighbors, implying that the time required to achieve their high level of religious devotion cut them off from worldly success. There's a good chance these people may have believed that the shrinking number of public confessions signaled a serious decline in religiosity in Massachusetts, as Field said. During a Dorchester conflict, when a Reverend Codman refused to occasionally exchange pulpits with Brahmins, as his parishioners wanted him to, the Orthodox minister's enemies were described as being exceedingly fond of amusements. Field said this statement pointed to an underlying class conflict, but again, he didn't describe how it was received. The ultimate secularization of the church did occur in this Dorchester conflict, when wealthy parishioners demanded a say in church operations equal to their contributions. Gasp! This was democracy, exactly what the Orthodox had been fighting all along. Field called out the irony of what would become ultra-conservative Boston elites fighting for liberal democratic ideals in their churches. But maybe he missed the point. Maybe the Brahmins' position was like that of the Baptists during the Revolution. They weren't really against establishment and authority. They were against someone else having it over them. But the irony ultimately resolved itself when an 1821 Dedham court ruled that the assets of the church belonged to the parish, not to the saints. At that point, the Orthodox seemed to realize that Jedediah Morse and his crew had done them no good. Morse disappeared very rapidly from the picture, to be replaced with Lyman Beecher, who explained to the Orthodox that establishment was now against their interests because they had become the outsiders. So, having nothing left to lose, the Orthodox finally embraced what Field called their age-old populist rhetoric concerning the ungodliness of the wealthy and the dangers of materialism to create what he called the American religion. Abandoning establishment allowed the Orthodox to try to recruit middle-class people who'd been drifting toward Baptist and Methodist sentiments. The ministers swallowed their pride and embraced revivalism, holding 116 in Massachusetts in 1831. 81 churches, that is, ministers and communicants, were, quote, exiled by parish revolts in 1833, according to a study made by the Orthodox and presented to their General Association of Massachusetts Ministers. Was this the meeting that Mason Grosvenor attended, which prompted him to go after infidelity and licentiousness in Ashfield, with such an effect on the story that I told there? The 11th Amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution, disestablishing religion, went into effect January 1st, 1834. This fits perfectly with the issues in Ashfield that I described in my biography of Dr. Charles Knowlton, and explains some of the undercurrents and tensions behind them. And because I did so much work on that, I will have much more to say on that in the future. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.